If God is good, how can God put a world into being that is not perfectly good? I used to think that evil was the result of free will, but if evolution is true, then there was evil before free will. Believing that all evil will eventually disappear forever does not, however, in my opinion, absolve God from allowing evil into this world in the first place. As I look at it now, evil in a Darwinist world suggests a dualistic God who created both good and evil, and is hence both good and evil. That would not leave much room for the Christian God. I hope you can shed some light on this. If God is good, why is there evil? That is one of the most challenging, most fundamental problems that the theist has to deal with, particularly the monotheistic theist. And it's actually supposed in this question that what exactly kind of God are we talking about that would allow evil, permit evil in the world, or create evil in the world? And the question asker appropriately differentiates between God in general and particularly the Christian belief in God. Because there is a really important distinction going on here that is so baked into the way that we think about God that it's hard to kind of get outside of that perspective sometimes. And it is the question of what kind of God are we proposing that we're believing in? Well, in polytheism, the belief in multiple gods or goddesses, the particular strength of polytheism in this specific case is that polytheism, at least from a conceptual standpoint, can explain the existence of evil in the world perhaps a bit more readily and with fewer problems at its face than monotheism can. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because polytheism can propose that there are multiple gods, goddesses that are not perfectly just, perfectly good, perfectly altruistic. We can suppose that there are gods that have what we would say competing values. They have a competing set of preponderances in the world, such that it's very, very normal for there to be the recognition that there are gods that create evil in the world within polytheistic religions. And the reason why the question asker, I think, appropriately outlines that in a Darwinistic sense of the evolutionary world, doesn't this seem to presuppose more of a dualistic God that creates both good and evil rather than the Christian God? And the reason why is because Christianity asserts that there is only one God. There is a monotheistic religion. And again, this is something that Christians take fairly seriously, as well as do Muslims and as well as do Jews and those who are of monotheistic religions. But we're going to focus in on, again, the conceptual question. Not asking the question as to which religion is true, but rather the conceptual setup for this question is, how can we believe in a monotheistic God such as the monotheistic gods of the biggest Western religions, such as Islam and Judaism and Christianity, without running into the problem of a good God being responsible for evil and therefore God being the creator of evil? Now, this is a significantly complex question. And in fact, for C.S. Lewis, one of the prominent Christians of the 20th century who came from atheism to belief in Christianity, this was the primary problem, the biggest problem that he had prior to coming to faith. And so we should treat this with a level of seriousness, and that there is not really what we would perhaps say a one-size-fits-all answer to this question. However, how would one from the monotheistic side that affirms God being perfectly good, perfectly just, perfectly loving, perfectly powerful, perfectly knowing, if we assert that that is the God we're speaking of, which is generally what Christians Muslims and Jews will say, then we have some explaining to do as it comes to what God's responsibility for or what God's interactions with evil really look like. Now, to paint a big picture on this, if God is good, why is there evil in the world? The way that Nicholas Beale and that John Polkinghorne answer this question really falls along the same sort of traditional Christian lines that Christian thinkers have thought about this for thousands of years. And those particular lines are, we want to perfectly say God is absolutely not responsible for evil in any way, shape, or form. God does not create evil. God is not responsible for the preponderance of evil, and God does not act in a way that we would say adds evil into the world. There is not a case in which Christians would ever say that God is responsible for evil. And because this is the assertion that God is not responsible for evil, we then have to, by necessity, relocate what exactly we mean when we say that evil exists in the world. First thing is perhaps fairly obvious. We're saying that evil exists in the first place. Evil's not illusory. We have a fairly solid understanding that evil is not simply made up in our minds and is not simply a relativistic world that is simply at its base level biological and perhaps violent. In other words, the world from a naturalistic perspective, one that, again, is more of the agnostic atheist camp, would simply say the world is just how the world is. And because we see the preponderance of suffering and violence, isn't that evidence that would say that God either doesn't exist at all, or the kind of God that we propose to say exists doesn't exist? By the way, this is precisely what C.S. Lewis would bring up when he was in the atheist camp prior to his conversion to Christianity. Well, one of the reasons why this is perhaps a bit of a more complicated thing at the surface than we might think is that we also hold that God creates the world perfectly free to choose, or in Polkinghorne and Nicholas Beale's language, free to self-make. And if we allow that, there is freedom to self-make. If we allow that there is lovingly given agency to the universe, lovingly given agency to humanity to choose the good or the ill, then we have to say that in some way, shape, or form, the allowance of evil, the permittance of evil by God, has something to do with the preservation of free will, which, by the way, is what the question asker actually intuitively understands. But there's a bigger problem than simply the preservation of free will. The problem is, why does there exist evil in the first place? And this, again, for Polkinghorne and Beale, has something to do fundamentally with the project of creating a world that is truly free, that is truly non-compulsive. And the problem with this is that because we both hold that we have agency, we have true free will to choose the good or the ill, and that God interacts with the world as if the world has true agency and true freedom to choose the good or the ill. This we see all over the place in the Old Testament and New Testament, that there is a very clear assumption by God himself that humans have the freedom to choose the good or the bad. Given that that's the case, we then have a quandary, which is that if God allows evil, there are good reasons for God to allow it, which could include the preservation of free will in the agents of humanity and the world. This is one particular avenue that could be the case. But it might not be the exhaustive reason, because perhaps, as C.S. Lewis points out in The Problem of Pain, the question about suffering is one that is very important. Why would God allow suffering in the world? Well, the basic argument that can be made in this case is that suffering in the world is perhaps analogous to having a toothache and needing to have a surgery done to repair the injury or perhaps the disease that involves that tooth. Now, the pain in the case of the tooth is indeed something that is excruciating, especially for those who have needed root canals before. There is a level at which it becomes dangerous to the rest of the body for us to not have to do something that has to involve intervention. But the pain in that tooth, from an existential sort of perspective, means more than simply the suffering that it causes. Rather, it is an indication that there is something amiss that must be fixed. The way that Polkinghorne and Beale point towards this is actually very much in the same line that C.S. Lewis points to this, which is that the suffering or the evil that exists in the world is not there for no reason. It's not there for no reason, for a random reason, or for simply evil existing gratuitously. There is something else going on that has to do with the fundamental self-making of the world, or the self-decisions, the agency that we have. And there is, as others would point out, perhaps not simply a failure of the kind of intellectual problem of evil, but a simple failure of our limitedness. For example, we know that we cannot take on an unlimited sort of perspective. We know that there is simply a finiteness to the things that we can know at a certain point in time. And there's always things that we know to be true after the fact that also show that perhaps some suffering that we go through is not for no reason, but is actually for some fairly important reasons that we would not have understood unless we went through it in the first place. To use the tooth example again, if I did not undergo the pain in my tooth, I would not be sensitized that there was a problem. I wouldn't know that there was a problem in the first place. In this way, pain is perhaps not necessarily, by its very outset, something that we would say is for the ultimate ill, but rather it can be serving for the ultimate good, such as avoiding having a really, really bad infection that would, in fact, be lethal to the rest of my body. There are pains that we go through as humans that are not merely pain for pain's sake, but rather pain that alerts us to a problem that exists. And in the question of why evil would exist in the presence of a perfectly good God, we could perhaps say that pain, evil, suffering in the world has a meaning far, far, far beyond our finite ability to see it, such as the surgery that someone needs that they may not know that they need, but that ends up saving their life in the long run. Surgery, by its very nature, involves the destruction of tissue, the cutting open of things, the mending things back together in a painful process. It's not a process that is without pain. However, that serves a much more important person of the holistic health of the person. That's at least one way or a couple of ways that monotheists will say that there's not necessarily a logical disconnection between there being a perfectly good, loving God and evil that exists in the world. Now, God never wills the evil. God never creates evil. And therefore, we have to, in some ways, hold our hands up and say, there is a reason why God allows certain things to occur for the ultimate good. However, we run into, again, another quandary, which is that how do we explain things that we simply have no explanation for, such as what Polkinghorne refers to as natural evil, natural disasters, things that have no human or other agency involved in that other than the mere collision of the physical world in a way that is destructive. Tornadoes, cyclones, things like that. Now, Polkinghorne has a particular view of natural evil that is allowing the evolutionary process to work itself out. However, philosophers and theologians have debated over what exactly we mean by natural evil in the first place. And what exactly do we mean when we say that there is perhaps a moral marker to a disaster event? To use different language, is the extinction of the dinosaurs an evil event? And there are some interesting debates over this. Again, do we say that things that don't have the capacity for suffering, which again, we're making an assumption here that dinosaurs don't have a reflexive sort of understanding of suffering. Watch last week's video to understand a little bit of that sort of philosophical move. But if things that do not have the capacity to understand or self-reflect or to suffer, to die of a natural disaster, is that an evil event? Again, that seems a bit cold to say that, but we can at least say there might be a distinction in what we mean by evil and what we mean by disaster events. Do we necessarily say that these things were an evil moral act? Hard to say that, and it depends on our distinctions. But the ways, again, that the monotheist would answer the question of, is God not dualistic, would be along these lines. But another important thing to just flag for this conversation is that Christians, specifically, have said since the patristic time period of the 300s and 400s that evil does not have an existence in and of itself, but rather is a privation of the good. It's sort of like saying that it's not that existence or the physical creation of the universe has anything evil that is contained within it, but rather that evil is the parasite that cannot exist without the physical universe. Or to use a different language, evil is the rot on a perfectly good piece of fruit. The fruit itself is a created good, it's a created thing, and the rot or the deprivation of its existence, the movement towards entropy, so to speak, that this sort of existence of the good is the only way that evil can exist. It doesn't have any existence in and of itself. It's not a rival bit of existence between physical world and non-physical world, but rather it is a physical good that is subject to decay. So if we think about it that way, if we think about evil as a deprivation of something, then what God does in the world is a perfectly creative process. And in fact, after the world's own making, the world is given its own agency to self-make after the ways in which God makes. And so we are part of that creative process. But the rot of the world, so to speak, the movement towards entropy, that's a significant quandary and a significant question that, at least in the Christian sense, we can say has something to do with the existence of evil, something to do with the existence of sin, and something to do with what we have to be redeemed from in the ultimate sense. So the Christian would say that there's not a contradiction between God being perfectly good and evil existing in the world, but it is a significantly complicated question. While I realize many thoughtful Christians, like C.S. Lewis, believed in demons and the devil, and it's in Scripture, the concept has become difficult for me to swallow. The red guy with a pitchfork is a poor conceptualization, and so is the idea that all human actions of evil on this planet are somehow the end products of his or his invisible minions' temptations. If we believe in a monotheistic God, how or what are we to do about other spiritual beings, particularly spiritually evil actors? Well, this is another important question, because as we talk about Scripture and as we talk about the traditions of monotheism, there is not again, a contradiction between there being a perfectly good, loving God and other created beings, other than humans, those beings that the kind of traditional language would say are higher beings than us humans, those particular beings being able to choose evil is something that is well established within the biblical tradition. What to do about Satan is an interesting question. And Polkinghorne and Beale actually point out the challenge of this, because Satan, Hasatan, is the Hebrew language for this. And what that means in the Hebrew language is the accuser. And the accuser, Satan, or the devil, the daemonion, shows up in various places, and often in a context in which is causative of suffering, is causative of choosing the wrong path, and is often in the language of tempter or temptation, the magnetic attraction towards choosing that which is not good. Well, what to do about this? Well, the challenge of this perhaps can be related to the capacity of humanity to do evil is not only about the human actors that are making the action, but also have to do with the temptation or the background push towards what humans choose the evil for, or what reasons that we choose the evil. To use an example of this, let's look at an example within the scriptures of Jesus' own temptation in the wilderness by Satan. Now, in this particular context, the devil is a real thing, a real person who comes to Jesus and tempts Jesus in specific directions. Now, it's very interesting that in the Synoptic Gospels, we have this in every single Synoptic Gospel, and we have the temptations that we have in some particular orders, sometimes flip-flopped depending on what it is, but they're the exact same temptations. And so the thing is that this was a real interaction that we see in multiple sources, and is simply assumed to be a presence and a power within the writings of the latter New Testament in St. Paul's letters, St. John's letters, and so on and so forth. And so there being a spiritual dimension to the world is certainly not anything unusual, and perhaps is simply part of the theistic landscape. It's not simply that there's only one spiritual thing in the universe and we call that God, and the rest of everything is physical. No, there's a much more complicated relationship to that. And as we say in the Christian tradition, that God created all things visible and invisible, that basically everything that's been created, both the spiritual dimension, physical dimension, and otherwise, are a part of God's good creation. But those parts of the creation, spiritual and otherwise, were again, as Polkinghorne would say, created with the ability to self-make, or created with agency to choose the good or the ill. And there are those creatures, we would say, that choose the good, and continuously choose the good, because they see clearly what the good should be chosen. Those could be the hosts of heaven, those who are the angels, who are the messengers of God, such as Gabriel or Michael or other named creatures of the spiritual realm. And likewise, that could be those saints of the tradition that have gone on into the realm of Christ, who are reigning with Christ as redeemed creatures who have been made whole and healed. But there are also those actors in the world who, by necessity, will choose the evil, something of which we simply have to hold our hands up to, especially in light of the world wars and in light of the Holocaust, in light of the genocides that happened during the 20th century. We have to say, and we sort of can't evidentially not say, that there is a significant problem of evil actors. And perhaps even to the scale that we can posit, as Polkinghorne himself says, that it's hard not to look at something like that and not be able to say that, at least positing, there seems to be a lot more going on than simply human actors, maybe a malicious actor from a bigger perspective, Satan, the devil, things like that. Again, the caricatures of the devil that this question asker brings up, the caricatures of the devil, absolutely, those are ludicrous examples, because to caricature evil in that case as the evil guy on your shoulder trying to make you do evil things is so simplistic that it's easy to kind of laugh at that. And in fact, that's kind of the whole reason why that was supposed to be laughed at, because it's a simplistic sort of way that we are caricaturing a real malevolent force that is significantly more tragic than we might think of at first. You said in your St. Edmund's lecture, 2002, the same cellular processes that have been driven the fruitful history of evolution through genetic mutation must necessarily allow other cells to mutate and become malignant. The anguishing fact that there is cancer in creation is not gratuitous, something that a more compassionate or competent creator could easily have remedied. Could God have not guided evolution so that we have bodies which attempt to kill off cells that mutate and become malignant? This question has to do with maybe not necessarily the existence of cancer, but more particularly a very important phrase that was used in the middle, the existence of gratuitous evil. Now, this is an important concept because gratuitous evil, that is the evil in which there is perhaps no meaning to and is simply a function of the way that the universe functions rather than the action of an evil actor. In other words, we can't, by our evil actions, simply say, I choose to have cancer, or I choose for that person to have cancer. Now, we can precondition ourselves to do that based upon certain activities that we do, but I don't think that we would ever say that the action of someone who all of a sudden has metastatic cancer in really any sort of way is by their own will or by their own evil actions. The answer to this question of gratuitous evil is that when we have the ability to self-make, from the physical processes, there are certain ways in which self-making also leads into dead-end paths, so to speak. There are ways in which we self-make that turn out to not be healthy in the long run, but that is a byproduct of us being able to do that in the first place. And it should be the case that cancer existing is also not by reason that we don't have the ability to not fight it. In fact, we know that in our bodies there are ways in which cancerous markers are taken care of by our immune system. And the existence of cancer within the body is an overabundance of metastatic cells that have mutated to the way that they are overproducing cells and becoming tumors and things like that. In fact, even in the World Health Organization, there is simply an acknowledgement that most people have the ability built into their immune system to deal with these on a very minute scale. And that whenever there is cancer that all of a sudden overruns the body's immune system, that is more due to the fact of the body's immune system unable to deal with the either scope or the type of cancer that is happening, not the body's inability to deal with cancer in the first place. Hence why we can have certain medical technology that can really help and assist the body being able to destroy these cells. And hence why we've seen significant improvement in people who are able to go into remission in cancer, which, by the way, is why we talk about remission. It's not the removal completely. It's simply that the body is able to keep these things in check. The body is never in a state of being perfectly free of any disease at any point in time. We rather are in a state of equilibrium between being overrun by certain microbes or certain cells and not having enough of them. This is, by the way, is another reason why having a healthy microbiome in your gut, having all of those particular sets of bacteria that in abundance is very deadly to us, but in the right proportions actually helps us digest our food. So, again, it's a complicated physical question. Polkinghorne, I think, would say that cancer is not an example of what we would say a gratuitous evil, but rather it is a function of the ways in which our ability to self-make is built into the creative process. And because we are finite and not infinite and self-sustaining such as God is, we simply can never expect for us to ever have the ability to perfectly self-create or self-make in a way that is going to be healthy every single time. Is original sin genetic or largely societal? Hasn't every individual person become corrupted through his or her own choices? I agree with you that we're responsible for our own sins, not those of Adam and Eve, but sin entered the world through their sins, and everyone after them has become corrupted by it through their own free choice. Am I right on this? For literally millennia, Christians have been trying to answer the question of what gives us the capacity or what gives us the push towards making the wrong decision rather than the right one. G.K. Chesterton famously said that original sin is the only theology in Christianity that is empirically verifiable. What he means by that is that by readily observing the world, we see the effects of evil and sin. And that's not something that is unusual, and it's not something that you have to look under a microscope for. It rather is readily apparent. It's not something you have to go and theologize about, that evil and sin exist in the world. G.K. Chesterton said it's self-evident. You see it everywhere. But what is the built-in capacity to sin? And why do we have a push towards or a pull towards that which is the bad? Well, Christians have tried to examine this question for many, many years, and the concept of original sin, which is the language that's used in this book, is the language that one of the big names in Christianity, St. Augustine of Hippo, proposes as the reason why we have a capacity to sin. Now, Augustinian theologians will also say that using the philosophy that Augustine had at the time, Augustine proposed that there was a physical engendering of that sin nature by the reproductive process. In other words, that sin is genetically passed on. That's how we would talk about it in modern day. That's not exactly how St. Augustine would talk about it, because genetics was not a thing until like 1500 years after St. Augustine. But in the philosophies of the time, it was basically the genetic process of passing on our lineage was, in fact, that vehicle that original sin used. Now, Augustinians, post the scientific revolution, especially after we get into some more hardcore genetic science, will say that that's no longer appropriate for us to say. That there's not what we would say a bare genetic tendency towards sin that we can simply point to from a physical scientific perspective, but rather that there is a capacity of sin inherent in humanity that is simply the state of who we are. And that it's not by genetic passing on, there's some sort of other explanation for this. Now, as the question asker points out, that he agrees that we are not responsible for Adam and Eve's sin. Now, that's not what original sin actually is when you read St. Augustine. St. Augustine was not saying that we're culpable for the same sins as Adam and Eve, but rather that original sin is the capacity to sin in the same way as Adam and Eve. It's a difference between culpability and the ability to perform something. But that doesn't matter for our discussion right now. What the discussion is getting at is, what do we have to say about what makes us sin? What makes us have that capacity? To put it in general terms, the ability for us to choose in free will, perfectly free, must involve, by necessity, the ability for us to rationally argue ourselves into choosing the good or choosing the ill. If we are completely free, if we are not being compelled to do something, if we are making a truly free choice, then there has to be some ways in which we are able to make the choice of evil. Now, this is very, very different than what we would say God is able to do. Now, again, it sounds weird to say that God is not able to do something, but to use an example from a previous class, Thomas Aquinas would say that God's action is perfectly identified with who his being is, and so therefore God never acts in hypocrisy to what his being is. If God is perfectly good, God, by necessity of his action being equal to his existence, God, by necessity, never commits evil. And so, from an ability perspective, we could say that God does not have the ability to choose to do the evil, because that is not who God's existence is. And the thing is that in humans, there is some sort of ability to self-make after a sort of creative process of the creator, who is far above, far beyond what we are. But in our limited capacity, whether by reason of society or whether by reason of a failure of being able to understand the long-term ramifications of what we do, or by simply choosing to choose the evil, we are able to commit evil actions. Now, this gets into the nature and nurture debate. Do people choose evil because it simply is the environment in which they are in, or is it because of something internal to them? This debate is probably going to go on far, far, far after I die, and far, far, far after any of us are still alive here to debate it. Because the question of whether it's the society that creates the capacity for us to do evil, or something intrinsic to the person, that is something that's been debated for thousands of years. But suffice to say, we have some evidential examples of both of them. We see how society can create this self-fulfilling prophecy of violence. We can probably point to some easy examples of that. However, we also can say that someone of their own volition can freely choose the evil for the simple reason of committing evil. And we actually have examples that we have looked at in the psychological studies that seem to have made the free decision to commit evil not based upon any other environmental reason other than it was their choice and they wanted it. Those are complicated and significantly disturbing examples, but it should give us pause before we say that original sin is simply off the table. We instead have to say there is a capacity of us being able to choose that is indicative of the original sin, or we sin in the same fashion as Adam and Eve. But there is a distinction between saying that we are culpable for someone else's sin and that we are simply committing sin in the same sort of capacity that our forebears have always done so. It seems that our free will chooses that which is in accordance with our nature. If God gave to man a nature that delighted in the good, that is, one in accordance with God's will, then man would choose with his free will to do that which was pleasing to his nature and therefore pleasing to God. But humans seem not to have been given such a nature. It seems that God then judges humans for the failure of the defective nature that he gave them. Is there any problem with my suggestion? If humans are an imprint of God, and as it says in other places within the scriptures, if humanity are God's children, how exactly is it that we act seemingly out of accordance with what our created nature is? It's a very good point. And this is something that, again, both Nicholas Beale and John Polkinghorne simply say, these are debates that have been going on for a very long time. But what they want to do is highlight that this is a quandary that the scriptures itself have a little bit of a gloss on, which is that there is, again, to go back to the Satan example, there are malevolent forces of which are exterior to the human being that are a part of that push towards making the bad decision. But there also is an inherentness to rational creatures to choose the evil. Or to use a Augustinian example in the 20th century, that humans are naturally selfish rather than selfless. It is so much easier for me to please myself and to do things that I like than for me to get outside of my perspective into the shoes of someone else. It's not that humans have the inability to act altruistically. We see altruism throughout nature. The question actually is, how are we so drawn like a moth to a flame towards the things that are destructive? Well, there actually is an interesting philosophical point to be made here, which is that if you create agents with perfect freedom, is it possible to conclude that agents are able to, at every single point in time, make the good decision for perpetuity? And is there such a creature that can do this? Well, the interesting thing about this is that, at least from the Christian perspective, there has only ever been one person that has ever done this, and that is Jesus Christ. For the Christian, the very incarnation of God into the universe, putting on the stuff of humanity and becoming truly human, the only example that we ever have of someone perpetually choosing the good is, in fact, only in Jesus. And one of the reasons why the scriptures have said this and have made an emphasis on this is because Jesus was not only human, but rather Jesus was also fully God. And to use, again, Aquinas' philosophy, if God only acts in perfect accordance to his very existence, then in Jesus there is both the finiteness of humanity, but also the infiniteness of God, such that Christ himself chooses perfectly in accordance with the will of God, of whom he is a person of that triune God, only in accordance with what the perfect, true, good will is. And because of that, the only person ever to give both the example but also the remedy for humans' finiteness in not being able to choose the good. Now again, that is a particularly Christian argument to be put here. But again, that is one of the Christian arguments that has always been put in this place. That to talk about creatures perfectly able to choose the good, even the created spiritual creatures of the hosts of heaven don't always choose the good. And likewise, we would perhaps assume, are still open to the use of their will in some capacity to choose the bad. This is where we see Satan and the fallen angels in the book of Revelation. It's not just that Satan is the one aberration of this, it's that no, there is a corruption that actually goes on in other creatures able to choose freely who they are choosing to follow. This is at least something that is brought up in the book of Revelation, and likewise within the existence of demons, the idea of spiritual beings that oppress the created world. So we at least have to hold our hands up to that possibility. But again, the capacity for humans to freely choose the evil is not only based upon the created nature of what humans are, but is a function of, at least in some ways, the finiteness of humanity and the ability for humans to perfectly choose that which is free and to perfectly choose that which can be good or evil. Does religion inspire evil acts? This is a common assumption by agnostics and atheists, and particularly those of the new atheist movement. The religion as the scapegoat for evil within the world is one that, when you look at the history of the world, can be evidential. You can put forward, especially the religious wars within Europe and the Crusades, you can put forward a number of examples in which religion is used as a cudgel for committing evil. However, religion as the scapegoat is, as most things, a very, very simplistic reading of evil in the world. As religion as that which is responsible for evil in the world when we start examining and getting down to the nitty-gritty, really is not a good description of reality. And we can see this particularly in the specifically atheistic or agnostic political parties within the 20th century. It would be kind of silly to say that Stalin's Russia or others such as that, that particularly try to suppress religion, is in any way, shape, or form less evil than those that use religion to commit evil. Rather, it might be that religion in the particular sort of way that this is used in argument is, in fact, not the central factor that is going on in this. The problem is not, perhaps, the religious observant, but rather the people who are the humans interacting with those religions. There's a reason why in Christianity there is the whole concept of redemption and the whole concept of forgiveness. It is the assumption that no one is going to actually act equitably all the time. And in fact, if you look at the kinds of people that become Jesus' disciples, especially the Apostle Paul, it's not even that those people are actually righteous to begin with. St. Paul, whom we understand as being a saint, was a murderer, and he became something more than that, something more redeemed than that. The thing is that the charge of religion as being the reason why evil exists in the world, again, extremely simplistic and is easily shown to not be the case in the wider sense.